Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new episode of LavaCon, where we gather and share expert insights on security program management delivered with, by, and for the most respected security leaders around the world. Together, we'll explore solutions to the most pressing business challenges unique to the careers of CISOs and cybersecurity executives. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
And here we are. We are having a conversation in the Blue Lava community, and this is Sean Martin. You're very welcome to join us today for this conversation. I'm thrilled to introduce a guest, Jasper Ossentjuk. He's the SVP and CISO for Nielsen IQ. Jasper, thanks for joining.
Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here today.
This is a cool thing. The community by the CISOs, for the CISOs. You're a CISO, paying it forward to the community. And the topic we're going to dig into today is all about crisis management. And we have limited times. We're going to get wide and deep where we need to. You have some specific things that you're dealing with that I think are important in the moment, but also set the stage for a broader preparedness for your CISO peers as they deal with crises. And before we get into that, though, Jasper, maybe a few words about yourself, your journey to your current role, and maybe a few words about what you do in your current role, just so folks have a sense of who Jasper is and why this is important for you.
Yeah. As Sean mentioned, I'm the CISO of Nielsen IQ. We're a large global firm. We do business in over 100 countries. And I've been here about a year now. I came from TransUnion, where I was the CISO for 6.5 years, and before that I had a number of CISO roles at a large global bank. Been operating on a global basis for many years. We built a global program at TransUnion, and we're on the journey now to build a global program at Nielsen IQ, which itself is just over a year old as a company. Nice.
And so the global is important, and we'll get into why that is. But I think this topic doesn't have to have a global nature to it or a global context to it to be relevant for folks. The size of your world as an organization may change, may be operating in Europe and Asia and the Americas, or you might just be in one state. But your world is your world, and at some point you'll face a crisis. So maybe if you can, Jasper, just to give us a sense of what crisis management means for you. What is it? Physical crisis, digital crisis? Kind of where does your role sit in that? Set the scope for this.
Yeah, I do like how you touched on maybe the global nature or the local nature doesn't maybe is not the most important point. What I would suggest is the most important point from a crisis perspective is it's generally something that happens that's unusual, something that generally is not favorable for your organization or your business, and forces you as a company to operate in a way that's not standard, that's not typical. It could be a cyber event, it could be a physical event. It could be, a worldwide pandemic, any number of things that force your business to think and operate in a new way is really what I'm thinking of in terms of a crisis.
And if I may, I'm not a CISO, I value the work that you do. I don't know that I could do it. for me, the crisis is something that falls outside. I don't know, maybe you can help clarify this, but organizations may have a business continuity plan, may have a disaster recovery plan, and that's kind of preparing for the things you might expect and trying to control that. And to me, a crisis is where, oh crap, something fell out of that norm that is not normal either, to a point where we don't know what to do necessarily. So I don't know, any thoughts on that in particular, and maybe what prompted you to want to have this conversation as part of the community?
Yeah, I think, Sean, you mentioned a couple things that are elements of crisis management. And I generally think in terms of crisis at the umbrella level. And so overarching all of the things you mentioned, business continuity and disaster recovery, you sit at the higher level as crisis. And I generally think in terms of more impactful to the organization and more stakeholders either being impacted or engaged or need to be engaged to manage through the crisis. And your disaster recovery plan may be part of it. Your preparation for business continuity may be part of it. And sitting at the highest level though is a crisis, and it should be a process that scales up and down. And so your disaster recovery plan may be as small as, I had a server failure in the data center today, and I have a process to quickly recover that server through my disaster recovery plan or my high availability architecture. But it doesn't rise to the level of crisis. I don't need to engage, business leaders potentially or other leadership in the organization, or, probably not the board, depending on the nature of the failure. But as those things maybe cascade and you look at how it unfolds or how any event unfolds, I think you need to be prepared to make decisions about what is the scale of this event up and down, and what's my response level, what's my communication requirement, who needs to be engaged as a stakeholder.
And so this conversation is about what the board needs to know about crisis management. I suffice, I guess, to say that the board isn't putting that crisis management plan together. They're an interested stakeholder that want to make sure that that's in place. How do you as a CISO prepare that plan, the crisis management plan? Who else is involved? Do you own it? Does the risk management team own it? Who owns the plan? Your role within that, and how do you begin to prepare that in a way where a board understands something has risen to a level that's pretty significant? Yeah.
I think at Nielsen IQ, I do own the crisis management plan, but I don't own it alone. There are a number of stakeholders that need to be involved, and I think more of my role in ownership is facilitation. And if you think in terms of facilitation, it's all about who are the stakeholders that I need to engage. So recognizing I'm not the subject matter expert in any of the domains or in most of the domains, many of them sit outside of typical sort of security, whether cyber or physical security, including customer communications or media communications. It starts from understanding, what are the scenarios that may impact, my company, and, what's the business value of the assets that we have at risk, and what are different ways that risks can manifest, and do we have adequate planning and the proper stakeholders engaged to do it? And, part of what comes to mind for me in this is, I can react to a crisis at the time it happens and maybe, work my way through it, with smart people and hard work, and or I can do some planning in advance. And in that planning, I can talk about what are the assets I have, the products and services that I offer in the marketplace, the expectations that customers have, maybe the expectations that the general public has of the product or service that your company provides. and understanding the risks, and then you can create scenarios. And from those scenarios, you can then begin to understand who are the impacted individuals, who are the key stakeholders, who are the key decision makers. And this is where the board of directors comes in play. And as a leadership team, you have to sort of understand what's the decision making that's within the scope at each level of a crisis. So to the example we gave before, if a server fails, that may not rise to the level of key decision makers. That may be regular sort of BAU day-to-day work. But if that server fails as a result, of a ransomware attack, for example, and with one server failure, you may not alert, but if you see a cascading event of continual and additional servers failing, you need to set some thresholds in terms of your communication plan and in terms of how you would engage. And I think the key element that you lay out to both management and the board when you go into a process like this is, I need to practice, I need to rehearse, I need to, speculate, and I need to plan ahead, because, when a crisis like this strikes, if it's large enough, you don't want to have to figure out things on the fly. You don't want to, guess who you need to call and find out they're on vacation and, uncertain about who their secondary is. The key message is you really need to plan for this. And, if you think about it from a sports metaphor, a crisis, you could say is like playing for the championship, but you don't go into the championship without planning, without looking at game film, without practicing, without making sure you've got the right players on the field. And, my view is when you play for the championship, you do all those things, you rehearse, you execute, you refine your plans, and make sure you're ready for game day. Crisis management, I view the exact same way as planning for, big championship game.
And again, I have limited view into how some of this works, so I'm thrilled that you're here to help, and your peers probably have some insight here as well. But how important is the story, the scenarios, to help people understand what some of the forcing functions might be to create a crisis? And where does that no longer matter when you're actually trying to build and practice a plan to deal with a crisis? Who is preparing for COVID, right? Not many people were preparing for that, but right underneath that is supply chain took a hit, workers were no longer a bunch of things happened under that. Who cares what the top driver was? But things happen. So how do you create scenarios that say things really big and bad can happen just to set the stage, but underneath are the things that we have to worry about as an organization that impact our ability to stay online, communicate with folks, deliver products and services, whatever it might be. How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it comes down to modularity. So, like any good sort of system design, if you think of your crisis management process and planning in system terms, you want to create modularity. And it really goes back to the business value of your business processes. And you just have to look at all your assets and understand, and maybe you think of assets in a broader sense. And so clearly everyone thinks my employees are an asset. And so you want to ask, what are the risks to my employees? They could be sick, they could be unavailable to work, they could be in an area where they have no power, no network access. They could be in a war zone, for example. And you want to plan for what are the downsides to that particular asset, and create alternatives for how you would manage around that downside. And I think you go through that modularity on an asset by asset basis. And if you've got a good sense of that, then I think you're more prepared. And especially if you have a good sense, you planned, you put technology enablement in place, you've got playbooks, you've got communication, education, training, and rehearsal. I think then when an unanticipated scenario happens, you rely on that modularity to say, okay, I can assemble these parts because I've been smart enough to plan ahead. I had the foresight to break things apart, in a piece by piece basis. And if my people are unavailable to work for whatever the reason might be, I know what my alternatives are already. And so if they're unavailable to work, maybe a global pandemic is a little bit of an extreme case, but if they're unavailable to work because there's, a war in their country, you should be prepared. And that might not be dissimilar from other events. I have a power outage, and that power outage could be the result of a natural disaster. Or a cyber event, or you can start to see that I've got modularity that says my people are unavailable. Maybe I don't know the reason why, but I have an alternative that says I can shift this work to another part of the world. And so, irrespective of the reason for the unavailability of that asset, I've got a plan. And so, the asset's unavailable because there's a war, I can shift the work. It's unavailable because a cyber event knocked out the power grid in that country or that jurisdiction, I can shift the work. If it's power outage because of a natural disaster happened, I can shift the work. And so you can start to see that planning, gives me the flexibility to understand how to react. Even for scenarios I didn't anticipate, I can break those scenarios down to their components, and I understand my plan for each component of my, my value chain of the assets in my organization that create value for me.
I love that description, Jasper. And I'm thinking of assets. And you mentioned server in one scenario. Your business might care about the server. There might be somebody in IT that really loves that server. The business appreciates the server because it generates a lot of money. But it's a server, right? You can have a redundant server, 2 redundant servers. You might have it in the cloud where you can spin stuff up at a moment's notice if it were to go offline or be ransomed or whatever the incident may be. When we talk about human assets, our employees, our partners, those are different, right? Those are people, those are human beings. And when you talk about, and what I'm going to drive to here is, it's a crisis is all about kind of reversing back through a series of decisions that get you back to a state that you want to be in, right? I mean, not maybe the exact state, but a state that you are okay with based on what happens. So a bunch of things happen. You're kind of making decisions to reel yourself back up to a desired state. How important, I'm getting to the plan part here, how important it is the planning and the practicing of that plan so that you don't make a decision that gets you back to that desired state or a desired state at the expense of a person.
Yeah, that's right. I've been, giving my examples in pretty simplified terms, but when a crisis happens, there will be multiple parallel paths of decision making, of execution of your plan, and you prioritize. And in all cases, the people on the team in our company are going to be the number one priority in ensuring their safety and their security. But these are things that, again, you should spend the time as a team to talk about, all of the assets. And maybe it sounds terrible to refer to the people as assets. But if you think of all the things that create value as an asset, you make a plan for what you're going to do in each case, and then you prioritize how you're going to spend your time and energy according to the value of those assets. And so clearly people are at the top. Servers, would be low. But really we're talking in a pretty granular level, because ultimately I think you want to contextualize it all in a business process. What's the contribution of these various assets to the business process? And it all needs to be risk ranked. And of course, I'm going to focus on safety and security of my people first and foremost before I look at the safety, security, uptime, resilience of my equipment. But all of this, in a mature planning organization should, be discussed, and you should understand, what I'm going to run to first. Because in a serious crisis like a war, there's going to be many things happening at once, and many things are going to be negatively impacted. To the extent you've got that, value and risk ranking understood of the various components of your business process, you can, simply refer to the playbook and begin, your process with the focus in order, as opposed to trying to figure it out in a moment of, pressure. It's going to be intense pressure in some cases, and decision making will be challenged in any case. So it's good to have laid it out, communicated it when times are, when you have time to think about it. It's good to pressure test it through, rehearsal, through tabletop exercises, and it's good to engage third parties to bring a level of independence, to help you evaluate. Have I thought about these things in the right order? Am I prioritizing things in the right way? Many cases, these crisis events are one-off. It's hard to learn from. It's hard to have had the experience, and leveraging a third party who maybe spends more time with more companies can bring perspective and value and help, the organization think through the proper prioritization of, people versus server is a very easy decision, but it gets much more nuanced, and that's why the lead time in the planning and communication is important.
Yeah, and I want to, early in the discussion, can't remember the term you used, but you own the crisis management, but you don't own it necessarily, right? It's a bunch of people, and I hearken back to my days as a program manager, where I had to look after quality assurance and the build process and the engineers and architects and perhaps third-party component providers and a whole group of folks. And then there are business stakeholders that have decision-making power in that as well. So bringing this together, you have a plan. Something doesn't go to plan, you have to respond to that. As a program manager, a matrix manager, you have essentially responsibility and no power, right? So you have to kind of get everybody on the same page, marching toward the same objective. How similar is that in your role, and how do you manage that to get people to do the right things at the right time, agree that they're doing the right things at the right time, and are focused on the outcome and not against each other if something doesn't line up, because that will happen at some point.
Yeah. That, the term I used is facilitation, and you said something I will push back on a little bit, and that is, as a facilitator, you have no power, and I think there's a lot of power in that leadership role, but it's maybe not. It's not power to just tell people what to do, but it's power to, help people problem solve. It's power to identify challenges, to identify friction, to identify, obstacles, and then it's power to problem solve through those things. And I think in a case, in a facilitative role, it's not dissimilar from, maybe my more day-to-day, cybersecurity role, where I might have strongly held opinions about security controls we should put in place, but ultimately management, is responsible for the risk appetite of the organization. To continue to bring the board into the conversation, the board has a responsibility to manage on behalf of the shareholders of the company and make sure management is doing the right thing. And I think as a facilitator in a role like this, those stakeholders become powerful allies in navigating challenges and navigating friction. And I think, one of the strongest tools is transparent communication, and, highlighting, look, the plan is complete, but we're stuck on this, and here's where we need help, and here's how we need help. Or, we can't make a decision about the priority of one item versus another. We need management's engagement. And I think as the leader of the crisis management function, it's a very powerful role to engage all those stakeholders and ensure that it's not just my opinion or my preference, but it's an organizational decision. It's a governed decision. The term I really like to use is that we've created a well-governed plan or well-governed program, and we've got the input of the key stakeholders and decision makers to do that. So I think it can be a challenging role, but I think the open, transparent communication and really embracing that facilitative decision-making role, you can help people come to the right outcomes. You can stay focused on what's important for the organization. And you treat it like, management controls the risk appetite and is governed by the board for that risk appetite. And it applies up and down the stack from a crisis management plan to, a cybersecurity program or, many of the control functions similarly should, management really should be involved in that decision making. And, it doesn't mean I have to go to the CEO and say, hey, is this okay? But we as a management team say, this is what we think is the best course of action. We want to make sure leadership, you guys understand, here's the process by which we came to this decision. Here's the people that we engaged to do it. And we want to give confidence that we've come to the right conclusions, and we're ready to operate on the basis of what the company thinks is right, not what Jasper thinks is right or what, any individual thinks is right. In most cases, I'm not smart enough to know to the point you made, and we do need to engage those stakeholders and decision makers, and throughout the company.
So I know we're kind of diving a little deep here, and I love the conversation. I want to get up to the board in a second, but I'm going to stay here because the board is expecting the team to do what they need to do to protect the organization, and having a plan is good. Practicing it will flesh out a number of things that you might not have thought about. And the first thing that comes to mind is, all right, there's a process. We have to communicate, right? How are we going to do that? How are we going to track what is success here? How are we going to track how far along we are to achieving success? So I'm wondering, the plan drives processes, and the processes in some cases requires tools, perhaps. And you may or may not have those tools. So I'm wondering, how do you handle some of that? Do you have to find new tools to communicate and project manage and keep track of everybody who's doing their part in the crisis?
Yeah. And it's and maybe if I'll broaden your question a little bit, because I think it's not just tools. It's, in some cases, you need investment of some kind, and that investment might be tools, or that investment might be more people, or that investment might be, engaging third parties to assist. And I'll rely on the same that I just mentioned, and that's transparent communication. And so, as the program comes together, you may find, gaps, you may find weaknesses, and those gaps could be, I don't have the right tool. Maybe I don't have all the backups I need. Maybe I don't have the ability to spin up new instances in the cloud, or I don't have enough people, or I don't have access to the right sort of third party. But I think that engagement of management and the board throughout the process is important. So not just when I'm managing a crisis, but also in the planning process, in the decision-making process, in the rehearsal process. And as you go through and you say, look, here's, I should have some assessment of the maturity of my program, of my plan, of my ability to recover from a crisis or to manage through a crisis. I should have a sense of, how mature that capability is. that should be communicated with management and with the board, when needed. And the facilitative role stays in place. I have to have a facilitated conversation that says, my crisis management program, as evaluated by an independent third party, suggests it's immature. And the independent third party suggests here are, recommendations on how to make it more mature. And you have again, facilitated engagement about the risk appetite of the organization. Maybe that level of maturity meets the risk appetite of the organization. And that, if I'm getting the direction of your question, I think that process, that engagement style, that facilitative role plays all throughout. Because even once you have your plan and you're happy with your plan and you start to execute the plan, things go wrong, things go sideways, things you didn't anticipate happen, and you need help to work through it. And again, transparency and engagement of the right stakeholders and decision makers is key throughout, for a successful program.
So talk to me a bit about the getting support from the executive leadership team and perhaps even the board if it's warranted, in terms of, I don't know, maybe describe how you start to build your crisis management plan. Is that something you do on your own to kind of get the core of it there? And you mentioned a third party, somebody who evaluates that. Clearly that has to be paid for. And then if there are recommendations, as you mentioned, budget has to come for that. So how do you work through that process, from initial creation and design to evaluation and actually putting it into practice?
Yeah. It depends, right? It depends on the organization, and that, some of the variables that go into that decision making are, what's at risk? How big is your company? What are the expectations of your customers? Are you operating in a regulated environment? Are you a regulated business or industry? Are there external expectations that, go beyond, just your customers? In the banking industry, the regulators have a perspective on, what the resilience of financial organizations should be. And they conduct exams, to evaluate. And so, it depends, but it comes back to what, the inputs into that depends scenario is: what is the risk? What is the business value at risk? And what are your customer expectations? And you just tell that story in a way that resonates with business leaders and helps them get the data points they need to make a decision. And so if you have an insufficient crisis man, as the facilitator of the process, if I think we have an insufficient program, I'll highlight the reasons why I think it's insufficient. And this is where it's helpful to, try to represent it in business terms. If we had a crisis of this nature, here's the impact to this product or service and the subsequent impact to the customers that consume that product and service, and the subsequent impact to revenue to our company. And we can have now a conversation around what kind of investment would protect that revenue. What kind of change could I introduce that might reduce that negative impact, that might reduce that downtime or that outage or that unavailability of a product or service. And then now we can have a meaningful conversation with leadership about, impact and likelihood. How likely is that risk to happen? And if it does happen, what's the impact? And how much would I spend, to avoid that? And that's not different. That's not any different from how I talk about security in my program. We talk about crisis in the same way. And it's just a matter of understanding the system, understanding the sources of revenue in the company, understanding how we go to market and how we engage with customers, and then starting to work through the risks that might manifest and create impact to that.
So I'm wondering, so you mentioned it's very similar to your security program and how you approach that. Are there elements throughout the organization that can be leveraged, data that can be leveraged, programs that can be leveraged, risk management, security management. What other parts of the organization can be tapped into? Because what I'm hoping to avoid for folks is starting from scratch and trying to recreate all of that kind of sits underneath this. So how does that all come together for you?
Yeah. Broadly speaking, in organizations, it's helpful to understand what the external requirements are. And so, if a company is subject to financial regulation, they should understand what the regulation suggests and the expectations are. If they're subject to an industry set of expectations, like the payment card industry, or they have healthcare data, there are external expectations of the regulators, and those become requirements to the program. But other partners and other data points in the organization that can contribute to the program are the internal audit function. They'll have a view on the risk universe in the organization. They'll have a view on both in many organizations, certainly in mature and large organizations, the audit function will have a view on financial impacts as well as on the IT impacts and the linkage there. And so they can be a good partner. Some organizations, certainly some large organizations, will have an enterprise risk function. They can be partners in understanding how to prioritize. And then, work that's been done from a disaster recovery perspective oftentimes is done on the basis of the priority of the systems or the priority of the data, and that's a useful input. And the team that manages disaster recovery is a good partner. And then, to the extent that business continuity is a separate function, business continuity may be looking at a separate set of events related to, a snowstorm that prevents people from getting into a call center. Any of these kinds of functions that are looking at control more broadly can contribute to the requirements, can contribute to the program, and can be, really good partners in, getting a program off the ground or maturing an existing program. We've experienced a lot of value and success in thinking along those lines with our partners. We have an audit function here at Nielsen IQ we work closely with. We have an enterprise risk function we partner with, and clearly we've been working with with IT and understanding high availability and disaster recovery, and things that we can do from that respect. So there's a lot of sources in most companies that are helpful in kickstarting a program or enhancing an existing program.
So I have a gazillion questions, but maybe we can have another conversation, digging even deeper. But I want to go back to the board and the executive leadership team, and your thoughts on this. The most important thing for the leadership team to present to the board with respect to crisis management, and as an executive, what's the one thing you would want the board to be asking you as the facilitator, regardless of your role? You happen to be a CISO here, but regardless of the role that owns it, what should they be asking the facilitator? Those two things.
Yeah, I think the board should ask, are we resilient? And the board, at the highest level, they should understand what's our resilience as a company, and are we doing the right things to ensure that resilience is, at the proper level? There is a zillion questions in asking, are we resilient? It's not a yes, no response. It's certainly nuanced, but, what I try to convey to the board, I would say the counterpoint to that in security is, are we secure, right? So are we resilient from a crisis perspective is, a similar question to are we secure? Also not a yes, no sort of question. But there's a way to to provide that answer. And there's a way to frame that dialogue and that discussion. And so, for me, it comes back to transparent communication. Here are the things we've done to prepare. Here are the stakeholders we've engaged. Here's the independent thinking that we've, brought to bear to make sure that we're not making bad decisions, that we're not making bad assumptions, that we're not too close to evaluating this. And the term I use is pressure testing, and you should pressure test your assumptions and pressure test your plan and pressure test the work that you have in place. If I'm a board member, I want to know that, I've had a governed body of work, and that governed body of work means the right stakeholders, the right thinking, the right third parties. And I've really engaged, the resources at hand to do the right thing. If I'm a board member, I want to know, are we resilient? And then I want to understand why or why not. And that's where the, gazillion questions can follow. And no board in my experience has that kind of time, but you need to help them understand the process by which you yourself are answering that question. Are we resilient? Here's how we're going about making sure we are. I think that's what I try to convey to the board in my security updates, and owning this crisis plan is new to me here in my career, and it's a new responsibility I've taken on at Nielsen IQ, and I'm engaging with the board in the same way about crisis as I have about security in my career to date.
I love that, Jasper, and it's great that you're actually in the thick of it, and we're touching on a lot of things here. I'm sure there's even more underneath, and I suspect the community, as they come together and connect with you, they'll probably have some specific questions that might be helpful for you to respond to. I'm going to ask you one now, though, as we wrap here. So your fellow CISO, CSO, crisis management facilitator, what would you advise them to do? Let's do this twofold. No crisis management plan, advice for your peers on how to get started, and then something they can do maybe this week to maybe take some action on that. I'll do that first.
Yeah, if you're in an organization with no plan or a very immature plan, maybe the first thing I would suggest is phone a friend, engage the community. My peers have throughout my career in security have been very helpful. In my peers, external, and my colleagues and people that I've worked with and have gone on to other places, very helpful in helping problem solve challenges, no matter what they are. And I would say step one, if you don't know where to start, is maybe have a conversation with a trusted colleague about what they do or what they've seen, or who else they can introduce you to start to help you think about it in the right way.
And for an organization, or more specifically a peer who believes they have a mature crisis management plan, what should they be looking at over the next few weeks, sometime this month, as an action?
Yeah, they should, if they're a leader in a mature program, they should look at how they can help others. They should look at ways they can give back. And they should look at, pressure testing, right? I would say anybody who thinks they have a good plan, it may be cliche to say now, but as Mike Tyson used to say, everybody has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And, I think that's true in the crisis world as well. Many people thought they had a plan till COVID showed up, and, nobody had ever thought about something of that scale or nature before, and certainly not many people. And, if you think you have a good plan, I would encourage you also phone a friend and have an open conversation, or engage a third party and pressure test your program to make sure you're not missing something. But if you've done all those things, then the last thing I would encourage you to do is help someone else. Make sure your friends and colleagues and people in the community are, working and aspiring to similarly mature plans.
Love it. And the program manager in me can't help but go back to something you mentioned earlier with talking about compartments. If you're only thinking about the whole and the elements underneath are falling apart, it's not gonna really matter. So I think you mentioned practice. So practice the components, practice the big thing, and leverage your peers to do that.
Yeah.
Super cool. Well, Jasper, thank you so much for sharing your insight here. A lot of experience bringing this together, and hopefully your peers enjoy this conversation. I'm sure, like me, many of them have more questions, but hopefully some good thoughts to take with them in the next week or two as they build and continue to mature and get back to the community. So thanks, Jasper.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Great to be here.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the LavaCom podcast. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.